welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a writer of Gothic horror who is here to talk about a book that, for the length of time it took to read, it has had a very long afterlife in my brain and has been really haunting my brain in the most interesting ways. And I am so excited to chat about it. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Absolutely. My name is Royce, and as you said, I am a writer of mostly Southern Gothic fiction, sometimes a few other things. And the book we're going to talk about today is my very first adult horror novella, which is called Hollow Tongue. It's coming out with Raw Dog Screaming Press on June 20th, and it is about a woman who has moved away from her southern home and has to return due to some physical and financial issues, and what she finds there changes her and the dynamic of her life afterwards. So that's the book.
It is, my gosh, when I read the description online, I knew immediately that I had to read it. And it, as I said, it has just like been really just banging around my head, thinking about all the imagery and just the things that it has to say about trauma and memory and how houses can be repositories for that. But before I get too deep into that, I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about your writing career in general and your journey to the book. You said that you wrote in some other areas as well, so I'm interested about that. And I'm curious what drew you to Gothic fiction, particularly Southern Gothic?
Absolutely. I started out my professional writing career because I've written for a long time, but I wrote for myself and just as a way to express myself and get things off my chest, not really to necessarily publish or share with anyone. But as I got older into my mid and late 20s, I started thinking, maybe this is something that I'm ready to share with the world. So I started out writing short fiction, and that was sort of a combination of things that just occurred to me. So I wrote a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of Southern Gothic horror, a little bit of sci-fi, just sort of whatever took my fancy at the time. And I really sort of settled into Southern Gothic because I love spooky stories. They've always been a favorite of mine ever since I was a little kid. And setting them in a place where I grew up and locations that I was familiar with, they just lent themselves so well to these unsettling, creepy stories. Not necessarily lots of blood and gore floating around and serial killers chasing you through a sleepaway camp, but those sort of resonant, unsettling things that could possibly be happening to your next door neighbor and you may never know. So those are the sorts of things that I just wanted to put on the page, and I really sort of started leaning into that probably about 12 years ago now. I published a collection of my short stories called Spooklight Southern Gothic Horror. I self-published it because I had all of these stories that I'd written that I'd sent out to professional magazines, and I'd gotten rejections for them. Some of them were sort of form rejections. Others were, we love a lot about this, but insert reason here. And so I thought, but I really love these stories. I really believe in them. So I put together my favorites and just sort of held my breath and pushed the button to self-publish them on Amazon, and shouted about it a lot on the internet and asked writer friends of mine to read them. And that was sort of the beginning of it all. And as far as getting here to Hollow Tongue, funnily enough, I started out this idea with wanting to write this sweet, tender fantasy, maybe even something a little romantic with this sort of upbeat ending, and no one wanted to publish it. I went through about 5 different revisions before I just went, fine, fine. And I set it aside. And I saw the call for submissions for horror novellas. And I thought, you know what I'm going to do? Nobody wanted this sweet fantasy from me. I'm going to make it into a horror story. So there.
Nice.
And that's where the idea for Holosun came from.
Wow, that is fascinating. That's a really fascinating origin for that story. Yeah, I love the series that it is a part of, this sort of a curated line of novellas from Raw Dog Screaming Press, who does like a lot of things I love. I'm a super fan of the press.
Absolutely. They are great.
Um, yeah, and I'm so interested in yeah, what you have to say about the Gothic, and one of the things that I love about horror, and I think that Gothic does this well too, is that horror is really good for exploring what is universal, like what all humans are afraid of, and for very specific fears that are like culturally and socially shaped and all these other influences. And so you get like in this book a really interesting combination of like very um almost primal sort of universal type fears and fears that emanate from occupying a very certain spot in society and in your own body and all these different things going on. So could you tell us a little bit about Maxine, what went into crafting her and where she finds herself at the outset of this novella?
Absolutely. Maxine started off life in a very small Southern household, very traditional. She is the only daughter of what's called in the book old people's churn. So she was born to parents that were further along in life and grew up a bit sheltered with some uber traditional values that maybe she didn't hold herself growing up. And throughout her growing up, she realized um, the oppressive tone and nature of the household she was in. And being an only child and being in a household where one parent is being abused, maybe if not physically, certainly emotionally, certainly mentally, she clung to that parent and wanted them to be free of it together. But circumstances sort of mandated that she flee on her own and try and make a life for herself. And she finds that the places that she's moved haven't really always treated her very kindly. And she gets severely injured and decides it's time to come home, but I'm an adult now and I can handle this. And I'm going to take charge and I'm going to tell them what I'm willing to take and what I'm not willing to take. And she wants to have this control over her life, which all of us do. But coming back to that house, there's the house itself is just the way she left it. And it almost is sort of standing at the mouth of a tunnel, looking at looking at a place where you don't necessarily want to revisit. Even though you've changed, there's this sensation that the new you is still very thin and very fragile. And all of those years and all of that history just comes back so quickly and so easily. And this is a line in the book that I particularly love is maybe the real horror is how easily we remember.
Wow. Yeah, I love that line too. And there's another one that I love about the house being a time machine of the wickedest kind. I really like that line too. And that to me was a really resonant image for describing the way that trauma can feel like when you are reliving it. It is intrusive memory and sort of the visual reminders in the world around you. It captured those fears of just being afraid to go home after like a long time away. Um, could you talk a little bit about crafting that house, and its vibe, maybe? I don't, that's a very vague question. I don't know if I can clarify it at all. but it has the feel of a haunted house without being haunted. And I don't want to give too much away. If you want me to edit anything out, I will absolutely. But
But
um,
no, I think I'll try to answer. Um, and if I haven't answered exactly what you're asking, we can have another go at it.
sure.
Um, I think that for me, it started with I'm a child of the 70s, so I see on social media and other places there's a lot of sort of chuckling about um, the decor of the 70s, the fashions of the 70s, a lot of things. Um, but there was such a distinct look that houses had at that time, from the colors of um, refrigerators and bathtubs and, yellows and avocado greens and things like that, to these deep pile carpets in hues of browns and golds and oranges, and these distinctly sort of weighty pieces of fabric, pieces of furniture in unusual fabric. So there was this um, distinct look that I was going for sort of in my head, of a place that was distinctly different than sort of the minimalist look of what's popular now. Things in very clean lines and very stark and um, streamlined choices. Something so different from Maxine's parents, who have their house in a way that, it looked when they got married in the 70s. So coming into something so distinctly different from a more stark living experience like Maxine had been living for the past 7 years, and coming back into this furniture heavy, fabric heavy house that holds on to scent and memory, and it's almost a tactile feeling. And it also made me think of something that happened to me once, because there's a lot of scent and fragrance in Hollow Tongue. And this was years and years ago. It was one of my first jobs ever. And I was rushing for the elevator to get there on time. And there was a lady in the elevator, and she was super nice. She held the door for me, but she had on the strongest fragrance I have ever smelled in my life. And those doors closed, and it was like an extra person in there, an extra presence in this elevator with us. It was so heavy and sort of took up its own space. And you couldn't help but take a breath and sort of feel like you were taking in that fragrance as well. And um, even after she stepped off on her floor, that fragrance was still left behind. And, it's something that's very difficult to escape. And I wanted to sort of weave that into Hollow Tongue as well, because one of the things I love sort of being able to be, from a sensory point of view, really, really cemented in a story when I read one. So I try to write that as well. And I don't always see a lot of scent used in books and horror books in that way. So I really wanted to dive into that.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. It's a really beautiful theme in the story, as well, the sort of oppressive scent that Maxine sort of encounters throughout the house, and that like brings back memories in such specific rooms and places. Yeah, there's a lot there, I think, about how, houses are trapped in time the way that people can get trapped in time too. And when you go back into the
Absolutely.
spaces, yeah, you fall back into those old patterns. Oh, one question I had is about the pacing, because it does a really incredible thing, I think, which is functioning as a slow burn in in a novella of a very compact length. And that seems sort of paradoxical on the surface. You're like, how do you do that? So like, what is your strategy for manipulating pace when you have a small palette, as it were?
Absolutely. I think there's a difference when you look at, say, the short story format versus the novella format, because for me, at least, with a short story, I try to start as close to the action as possible because there is such a small window of word count to get the reader interested and carry the story to a resolution. But the novella to me feels more like we have a bit of time, so we want to start the reader with what sort of approaches normality for their main character before you take them on that journey of whatever it is that's about to befall them. So for me, I try to start a novella more like I would start a novel, as if I have more time. And then I pepper in things that are unusual, unsettling to keep the reader going, all right, well, I've got to know what this is about. Okay, this part has just sort of drawn me in. I need to find out the next stage. And then I sort of almost, maybe not flip a switch exactly, but I sort of move into more short story format with, okay, we've hit a significant sort of uptick in the pace. So now things are sort of starting to happen, and our main character is having to respond. So I think for me, there's this, I guess, hybrid of short story and novel that makes the novella for me. And I have to say, I really do love the format. And I love that length because I think it allows you to work to a Gothic and a Southern Gothic um, tone more so than a short story sometimes. The short story has to be a little bit pacey. And I think with something Gothic in nature where you want to have that slow burn, having 20 to 40,000 words is such a great space to work in because you can have in your mind, all right, I can see the climax of this book. What's the big fight or the big to do? But you can take your time getting there and just sort of thread in things that by the time the reader finishes, they think back on it and go, oh my gosh, that seemed so normal to me initially. And now I see that that early image was a warning or a precursor to what was going to happen, or this early scene really, really told me what the whole book was going to be about, and I didn't realize it till the end. So really loving the novella format.
Yeah, it's a great format, and I'm so glad that we're seeing more of it. I feel like at this time, especially in the horror space. I would love to talk a little bit about, if we can, the introduction. There is like a little introduction from the series editor that talks about the series as a whole, sort of in universe, though. And I'm curious, were you involved in the writing of that part at all? Like, did you communicate it all with the editor in order to craft that piece, or like was it a complete after the fact sort of appended to it?
It was a complete after the fact. After sending in the story and after I got my acceptance, um, I knew that it would have to go through some edits, and I did those separately and sent them in. And they said, all right, we're going to incorporate your changes. And when they sent me back the galley for me to sort of proofread, they said, oh, we wanted to let you know that the opening forward and the afterword has been added. Have a read over those as well if you have any changes or thoughts or suggestions or whatever have you. Let us know if you have any final changes to the rest of your manuscript. So I had no idea what they were going to write. And to be honest, I kind of loved that
Yeah.
because it felt like, I don't know, it felt like something that grounded the book in an earlier age because there aren't a lot of forwards and afterwards included in books any longer. Mhm. So it kind of sort of cemented it in that 2 or 3 centuries prior to where we are now, as a novella concept. So I'm super impressed with the way that was done and the way it was handled. And they approached me to write an afterword for an upcoming book later in the series. So be on the lookout for that too. So it was great the way they've set it up so that we're not only writing our own work, but we're also supporting each other and reading each other's work. And the afterword is written just in the voice of an author in another part of the series. But the foreword is written, as you said, in universe by a researcher that has stumbled upon this document.
Mm. I love a sort of I guess fictional provenance, for a piece of fiction. It just gives it this sort of weight of history and like an added sort of, I don't know, mysterious sort of feel to it that I really love as a librarian. Obviously, I'm very biased, but
Yes, I love that too. And I love books that have, I love books that have libraries in them, to be honest, and just have it a full in-universe library for research or just even a home library in a novel where they describe, a main character's awe and fascination with seeing this majestic library. So I was a library kid, so I absolutely adore libraries, and they are one of my favorite places. And one of these days, I will set a book in a library. I still have to figure out how to do that, but one of these days it will happen.
well, I'm going to hold you to that, and I'm going to ask you back to the show to talk about that one. So,
Absolutely, absolutely.
what is next for you? Do you think you'll work in the novella space again, or in the adult space, or will you be returning to young adult? What's on your horizon?
I have so much on my horizon right now. I have finished the edits for a Southern Gothic fantasy novella that's coming out in January with Tor. It is up for pre-order now. It's called Psychopomp and Circumstance.
Nice.
I love the title.
That's great.
It is set in an alternate history reconstruction era where a young, freed Black woman finds that her estranged aunt has passed away, and no one in the family wants to accept the burden of planning her funeral and laying her to rest. So she takes it upon herself to go to the city that she is unfamiliar with by herself the first time, without the support of her parents or family, and finds this very strange city and town, and a house that houses her aunt's secrets, and a very intriguing mortician that helps her along the way.
Ooh, that sounds great too. My goodness. Well, thank you for sharing this book with us and your upcoming projects. I'm so excited to see what you do next. Thank you for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Okay, listeners, it's your turn. Please check out Hollow Tongue, and make sure you check out Psychopomp and Circumstance too while you're at it, because that sounds really cool. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter. Bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.